There are moments in history that medicine recorded, set aside, and never fully resolved. Not because the physicians lacked intelligence, many of them were among the finest minds of their generation, not because the evidence was lost or corrupted, but because the evidence pointed somewhere that no rational man of the 19th century was willing to follow. This is one of those moments. What happened in Harlow County, Georgia, in the late summer and early autumn of 1864 was documented. It was witnessed. It was argued over in letters between doctors that still exist in private collections and state archives. And yet, more than a century and a half later, no one has produced a satisfying explanation for how a 7-year-old boy named Elias spent 31 days sealed inside a room with no food, no running water, and no means of conventional survival, and walked out of it breathing, not stumbling, not delirious, breathing. This is his story. And before it ends, I want you to ask yourself one question. Is the most frightening thing in this account the boy who lived, or is it everything else that surrounded him? Stay with me. Georgia in the late summer of 1864 was not a place that held itself together easily. The war had taken most of its able-bodied men. It had taken grain from the fields, horses from the barns, and a particular quality of certainty from the air, that quiet belief, common to all settled places, that tomorrow would resemble today. In Harlow County, which sat in the middle of the state like a forgotten patch of earth that even armies found uninteresting, the war was more of a presence than an event. It rumbled distantly. It sent letters that arrived weeks late, informing families of deaths that had already been mourned in dreams. It sent men home early, broken in ways that could not be named at the dinner table. But Harlow County continued. It had a general store run by a man named Prosper Lane, who kept prices reasonable and his opinions to himself. It had a Baptist church where Reverend Harold Cates delivered sermons of admirable brevity on Sundays and occasionally on Tuesday evenings when the mood struck him. It had a mill, a smithy, a school that operated 6 months out of 12, and perhaps 420 souls distributed across farms, clearings, and the town's single main road, which was called, with the blunt practicality characteristic of the region, Mill Street. It also had the Voss farm. The Voss property sat approximately 2 miles northeast of Mill Street, on a rise of red clay land that had been in the family since the 1820s. The house was old enough to have 2 generations of repairs visible in its construction. Newer planks alongside older ones, a porch that had been extended once, a root cellar that had been dug deeper than originally intended after a flood in 1847, proved the original depth insufficient. It was not a grand house. It was a working house, the kind that bore the evidence of its own labor openly, without apology. In the late summer of 1864, the household consisted of 4 people. There was August Voss, 53 years old, a man of angular silences and deliberate movements. His wife, Harriet Voss, had died of fever in 1859, and he had raised his remaining children without remarrying, a fact noted by the county as unusual, a fact August noted to no one because he did not discuss his marriage, his grief, or his decisions with anyone outside the house. His elder child was a daughter named Ruth, 19 years old that summer, who managed the domestic operations of the farm with a competence that most observers found remarkable and a few found unsettling. Ruth was not cold, but she was precise. She spoke when speech was useful. She observed more than she volunteered. People in Harlow County trusted her without fully understanding her, which is perhaps the most useful kind of trust. And then there was Elias. Elias Voss, 7 years old as of that April, was the kind of child who is difficult to describe without immediately resorting to the word strange, a word that, in retrospect, carries more weight than it seemed to at the time. He was small for his age, fine-boned in the way that sometimes indicates fragility and sometimes indicates something else entirely. He had his mother's coloring. Pale, with hair so dark it looked almost blue in certain light. His eyes were grey, which in the county was considered either beautiful or unlucky depending on whom you asked and what mood they were in. Elias did not speak much. This was noted by his schoolteacher, a woman named Agnes Pruitt, in a letter she wrote to the county school board in the spring of 1863, requesting guidance on a pupil who attends and observes but participates only reluctantly, and when he does speak says things that suggest he has been listening very carefully to conversations he was not intended to hear. That letter received no reply. The school board had other concerns. What Agnes Pruitt did not record in her official correspondence, but did describe years later in a personal diary that was donated to the Georgia Historical Society by her granddaughter in 1934, was that Elias Voss had a habit of sitting very still in the corner of the classroom during the noon recess hour while other children played outside and staring at the wall, not vacantly, not with the blankness of a distracted child, with what she described, somewhat uncomfortably, as focused attention, as if he were reading something she could not see. She mentioned this to August Voss once, during a parents' day in the fall of 1862. August looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "He does that at home too," and he said nothing further. The house on the Voss farm had 7 rooms. This is an important detail, and I ask you to hold it, because the architecture of this story is inseparable from the architecture of that house. On the ground floor, a front room used for sitting and receiving visitors, a kitchen, a dining room, and a narrow storage room that had once been used as a pantry. On the upper floor, 3 bedrooms. August's room faced east, Ruth's room faced north, Elias's room faced west toward a stand of pine trees that blocked the afternoon sun and kept the room unusually dark even in the height of summer. Between Ruth's room and Elias's room, there was a door. This door had not always been there. According to the county deed records which survive, the upper floor of the house was modified sometime around 1851 or 1852 when the original 2-bedroom configuration was altered to create a 3rd bedroom. The wall between the existing north room and the west storage area was partially opened, a door was framed and hung, and the storage space was converted into a sleeping room. The door was not remarkable. It was a standard pine door with an iron latch, the kind found throughout Georgia farmhouses of the period. What was slightly unusual, and this detail appears in the written account of Dr. James Felder, who examined the house in October of 1864, was that the door had been fitted at some point with an additional iron bar on the exterior side, the kind of bar used to prevent a door from being opened from within. Dr. Felder noted this and wrote in his account, "When I asked Mr. Voss about the iron bar, he said it had been installed by the previous owner. I could not verify this claim, and the hardware appeared consistent with more recent installation, though I could not determine the date with certainty." August Voss did not offer any further explanation. The room itself, Elias's room, measured approximately 9 feet by 11 feet. It contained a bed, a small chest for clothing, and a wooden chair. There was a single window on the west wall, approximately 18 inches wide and 24 inches tall, set into a frame that, as Dr. Felder also noted, had been nailed shut at some point. Not latched, nailed. Several cut nails had been driven into the frame at intervals, making the window impossible to open without tools. Below the window, in the baseboard, there was a small gap, perhaps 1.5 inches in width, perhaps 2 inches at its widest, where the baseboard had warped away from the wall over years of seasonal expansion and contraction. This gap ran approximately 14 inches along the length of one section of baseboard before the wood pressed back against the plaster. This gap will matter. I want you to remember it. To understand what happened in September and October of 1864, you need to understand what the summer before it looked like. July of that year was brutal in Georgia. The heat was the kind that doesn't announce itself as dangerous because it presents itself as ordinary. It is simply the air, and the air is simply this. And the idea that it could be otherwise begins to feel like a fantasy from another country. Crops dried at their roots. The creek that bordered the eastern edge of the Voss property dropped to a trickle by mid-July and stopped running altogether for 10 days in August before a thunderstorm briefly revived it. August Voss worked through the heat without complaint, which was consistent with his character. Ruth worked alongside him. Elias, too young for the heaviest work, was assigned lighter tasks, feeding the chickens, carrying water to the garden plot, collecting kindling from the tree line. It was during this summer that two things happened that would later be considered, in retrospect, to be part of the same story. The first was the arrival of the soldier. His name was Thomas Greer. He was 24 years old, a private in the Confederate infantry who had been furloughed following a wound to his left shoulder, received at a skirmish in northern Georgia in June. He arrived in Harlow County in late July, making his way home to a farm some 3 miles south of the Voss property. He passed through the Voss land on his way, stopped to ask for water, and was invited to stay for supper by August, an act of hospitality that was standard in the county and that neither August nor Ruth would later describe as anything beyond ordinary. During supper, Thomas Greer talked about the war. This too was ordinary. Every man who came back talked about the war, if only because those who hadn't gone were hungry for information, and those who had were hungry to put what they'd seen into words that would allow them to sleep. The conversation covered the usual ground: the heat in the northern campaigns, the shortages, the particular character of waiting, the endless, specific tedium of military life punctuated by moments of such concentrated terror that no language built for ordinary life could contain them. Elias sat at the far end of the table and listened to all of it. At one point, Thomas Greer noticed the boy staring at him and said, with the easy manner of a young man accustomed to children, "What's got you so interested, son?" Elias said, "You have something on your shoulder that isn't the wound." Thomas Greer went very still. August Voss set down his fork. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds before Ruth asked Thomas if he'd like more cornbread, and the conversation resumed, and the moment was absorbed back into the ordinary texture of the evening. Thomas Greer left after supper, thanked August for his hospitality, and made his way south without looking back. That night, according to Ruth's account, which she gave to Dr. Felder in October of 1864, and which he recorded verbatim in his notes, she went to Elias's room to tell him good night and found him sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, facing the window. "Why aren't you in bed?" she asked him. He said, "He's going to be all right." Ruth, who did not know what he meant and did not particularly want to, told him to lie down and went to her own room. Thomas Greer, for what it is worth, survived the war. He returned to Harlow County in the spring of 1865 with his wound healed and his shoulder largely functional. He lived to the age of 67. This has no direct bearing on the events of September 1864, and yet I include it because Elias said it in July, and it turned out to be true. And that is the kind of thing that is easy to dismiss and difficult to forget. The second thing that happened that summer was the visit of Dr. Emmett Crane. Dr. Crane was the county physician, based in the town proper, who made regular rounds to the farms when his services were requested. He was called to the Voss property in early August because Elias had developed what August Voss described in his brief note, delivered by a neighbor's son, as a persistent cough and some difficulty sleeping. Dr. Crane was 51 years old, trained at the Medical College of Georgia, a practical man with a direct manner and a genuine dislike of ambiguity. He arrived at the Voss farm on the 4th of August and spent approximately 2 hours examining Elias. The cough, he determined, was mild, likely dust from the dry summer, nothing alarming. The sleeping difficulty he attributed to the heat, but he noted something else, which he recorded in his case journal. The boy is underweight for his age and height. His color is acceptable, lungs clear, heart regular. However, he exhibits an unusual quality of stillness during examination that is unlike ordinary childhood compliance. It is more total than that, a degree of physical quietude that I have not previously encountered in a patient of 7 years. When I asked him where it hurt, he looked at me for a moment before answering, and then said, It doesn't hurt anywhere yet. I asked him what he meant by yet. He said he didn't know. I recorded this as a child's imprecise communication and did not press further. Dr. Crane prescribed rest during the hottest hours of the day and a tonic of his own preparation, iron sulfate dissolved in water with a small quantity of molasses, to be taken each morning. He charged August $1 for the visit and left. He would return to the Voss farm 6 weeks later under very different circumstances. September arrived in Harlow County with a brief, merciful cooling. 3 days of lower temperatures and a light wind from the north that everyone found such a relief that it was spoken of with the gratitude typically reserved for acts of God or kindness from strangers. On the morning of September 3rd, a Saturday, August Voss rose before dawn, as was his habit, performed his morning work, and came in for breakfast to find Ruth already at the stove, and Elias sitting at the kitchen table, still in his nightclothes, staring at the surface of the table. "You sleep?" August asked him. Elias said, "Not really." August sat down. Ruth served coffee, substitute coffee, the real article having been scarce for over a year, and cornbread with a little honey that remained from the previous season's hive. Elias ate without appetite, which Ruth noted but did not comment on. This had been a pattern throughout the summer. The boy ate, but as if eating were a task rather than a pleasure, performing it with the same blank competence he applied to his chores. After breakfast, August went back outside. Ruth began the morning's domestic work. Elias went upstairs. At some point between 9 in the morning and noon, neither August nor Ruth could fix the exact time more precisely than this, Elias went into his room, closed the door, and did not come out. This was not, initially, alarming. Children retreat to their rooms. It was a Saturday, there was no school. There. Ruth assumed he was resting, perhaps reading. The house had a small collection of books that Elias used with regularity, working his way through them with the same systematic quietude he brought to everything. She called him for the noon meal. No answer. She went to his door and knocked. No answer. She tried the latch. The door opened without resistance. The iron bar was not engaged on the exterior. The room was empty. Ruth stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the empty bed, the chest, the chair. Then she went downstairs and outside to find August. They searched the property for 3 hours. The barn, the outbuildings, the garden, the tree line, the creek bed. They called his name until their voices took on the particular thinness that comes from calling into silence. A neighbor, James Holcott, happened to pass on the road and was recruited into the search. His wife and their 2 sons came within the hour. By late afternoon, the boy had not been found. It was James Holcott who, returning to the house to report his section of the search, unsuccessful, climbed the stairs to Elias's room one more time, having already checked it twice, as had August and Ruth, and this time paused at the door. He stood there for a moment, then he knocked on the door and said quietly, "Elias?" From inside the room, which had been established to be empty on at least 2 separate occasions that afternoon, came a very faint sound. James Holcott later described it to Dr. Felder as follows. It was not a word. It was more like someone adjusting their position, the way you hear through a wall when someone shifts in their sleep. Just a small sound. A present sound, you understand? The kind that tells you there's something alive nearby. He tried the latch. The door did not open. Not because the iron bar had been engaged from the outside. It had not been. The door simply did not open. The latch moved freely when he depressed it, but the door remained in its frame as if sealed. August Voss arrived at the top of the stairs within seconds of Holcott's shout. He tried the door himself. Same result. He put his shoulder to it. It yielded slightly. There was give in the wood, the ordinary flex of a pine door in its frame, but it did not open. He called through the door. "Elias, open this door." Silence. Then, from very far away or from very nearby, accounts differ on this point, and the difference matters. A sound. Not words. Not quite a voice. The nearest description, used independently by both August Voss and James Holcott in their separate accounts to Dr. Felder, was breathing. Regular, slow breathing, the kind associated with deep sleep. But the room had been confirmed empty. August Voss sent James Holcott for Dr. Crane. Dr. Crane arrived at the Voss farm at approximately 7 in the evening, having been found at the home of another patient and making the journey on horseback at a pace he described in his notes as faster than was probably necessary given the stated facts. He had been told only that the boy was locked in his room and would not respond. What he found when he arrived altered that understanding somewhat. He examined the door. He confirmed that the latch mechanism was functional. It moved freely and did not appear to be jammed or broken. He confirmed that the iron bar on the exterior was not engaged. He examined the frame and the door itself with a lantern and found no obvious cause for the failure to open. No swelling, no debris, no visible warping beyond the ordinary settling of old wood. He instructed August to try the door again in his presence. August did. The latch moved. The door held. Dr. Crane tried it himself. Same result. He then called through the door clearly and firmly. "Elias Voss, this is Dr. Crane. I need you to open this door or step away from it so I can check on you." From inside, that same sound. That slow, steady breathing. Dr. Crane pressed his ear to the door. He stood there for what witnesses described as a full minute, listening. When he straightened up, his expression was one that Ruth Voss would describe, years later, as the face of a man who has encountered a problem that his training did not prepare him for. He told August to get a pry bar. It took August and James Holcott together approximately 15 minutes to work the door open, using 2 pry bars applied to the top and bottom of the frame alternately. When the door finally gave, it did not break. It simply came free, as if whatever had been holding it had decided to relent. There was no visible cause for the resistance even in the opened frame. No nail, no bolt, nothing. Inside the room, Elias lying on his bed, eyes closed, breathing exactly as they had heard through the door. Ta-da! Crane crossed the room in 4 steps and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Elias opened his eyes. He looked at Dr. Crane without surprise, without distress, with the same quality of focused calm that the doctor had noted in his August examination. "Are you in pain?" Dr. Crane asked. "No," Elias said. "Can you get up?" Elias sat up, swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood. His color was normal. His eyes were clear. He showed no disorientation, no sign of prolonged sleep, no stumbling. Dr. Crane examined him then and there. Pulse, eyes, tongue, temperature, all within normal range. "Why didn't you open the door?" Dr. Crane asked him. Elias looked at the door for a moment. "It wasn't time yet," he said. Dr. Crane wrote this exchange in his notes verbatim and added, "I cannot account for the boy's statement. I cannot account for the resistance of the door. I can only document that at the time of my examination, he was in sound health and exhibited no signs of illness or distress. I recommended that his father keep a closer watch on him and told August Voss that the door mechanism should be examined and repaired." He rode home. He would be back. He just didn't know it yet. In the 2 weeks that followed the first incident, life on the Voss farm returned to something approaching its previous character. The door to Elias's room was examined by a carpenter from town, a man named Uriah Tate, who spent 40 minutes on it and found nothing wrong with it mechanically. He replaced the iron latch with a new one, drove new screws into the hinges, and declared the door sound. Elias attended to his chores. He ate his meals, still without enthusiasm, but consistently. He went to bed when told. He said little, which was not unusual. The one thing Ruth noted in the account she gave Dr. Felder was that during those 2 weeks, Elias asked her 3 times about food. Not in the way hungry children ask about food, not, "What's for supper?" or "Can I have some bread?" He asked her specifically about how long a person could go without eating. The first time she answered without thinking. 3, maybe 4 days at most, she told him. That's what she'd always heard. The second time she asked him why he wanted to know. He said he was curious. The third time, she told August. August went to Elias and asked him directly what was on his mind. Elias looked at him for a moment. That particular look, the one that everyone who spent time around the boy eventually encountered, that sense of being assessed by something older than the face it occupied, and then said, "I don't know yet." August told him to stop asking about it and go help with the fence mending. Elias went. On the morning of September 19th, Ruth came down for breakfast and found that Elias had not come downstairs. She went to his room. The door would not open. She did not search the property this time. She went directly to August. August tried the door. The same resistance as before. The latch moved freely. The door held. He called through it. That breathing. This time, he waited 20 minutes before going for Dr. Crane, because some part of him, some part he did not explain to anyone, but which Dr. Felder later said was entirely understandable given the previous incident, needed to know if the door would eventually open on its own. It did not. Dr. Crane arrived to find August and Ruth sitting in the hallway outside the room, waiting. He tried the door himself. Held. He asked August for the pry bars. "Wait," August said. Dr. Crane looked at him. "Last time the door just let go," August said. "When we had both bars in and we were working it, it just let go. Before that, it held like it was iron." Dr. Crane considered this. "Has anything changed in the room?" he asked. "Furniture moved? New items?" "No," August said. "Has the boy mentioned feeling unwell?" "No." "Has he eaten normally?" Ruth said. "Yesterday he ate well. This morning he hadn't come down yet when I found the door sealed." Dr. Crane pressed his ear to the door again. That same breathing, slow and deep. He stepped back and looked at the door for a long time. Then he sat down on the floor of the hallway, put his back against the wall opposite the door, and said, "We wait." They waited for 4 hours. At 2 in the afternoon, the door opened, not under anyone's hand, not with anyone touching it. It simply opened, swinging inward of its own impetus, slowly, the way a door opens when someone on the inside has unlatched it and let it fall open with gravity. The room beyond was empty for a fraction of a second, or so it appeared to the 3 people in the hallway. Then Elias was there, sitting on the bed, precisely as he had been the first time. Eyes closed, breathing, present. Dr. Crane was across the threshold before the door had stopped moving. Elias again opened his eyes without surprise. "How long?" Dr. Crane asked him. "Since last night," Elias said. Dr. Crane checked the boy's watch. He did not own one, but August did, against the last time Elias had been seen. Ruth confirmed that Elias had gone upstairs after supper the previous evening at approximately 7:30. They were now at 2:15 in the afternoon. Approximately 18 hours, no food, no water that anyone could account for, no visible distress. Dr. Crane's examination this time was more thorough. He spent 40 minutes with the boy, and his notes from that examination are among the most detailed of his career. Pulse, regular, 64 beats per minute, which is within normal range for a child of his age and size. Temperature, normal by palpation, no fever, no unusual coldness. Skin, hydrated, no evidence of excessive thirst despite the claimed duration without water. Eyes, clear, responsive, no signs of dehydration. Mental state, fully oriented, coherent, communicative. He told me, when I pressed him, that he had not been hungry. I asked if he had consumed anything in the room, water from any source, food he might have hidden. He said no. I examined the room as thoroughly as I was able. I found no hidden food or water. The window was nailed shut, as I noted on my previous visit. There was the gap in the baseboard, which I noted but considered too small to be of practical significance. I left with a profound uncertainty that I did not share with the family in full. He shared it instead with a colleague. Dr. Emmett Crane had maintained a correspondence since his medical school years with a physician named Dr. George Harlan Peete, based in Savannah. Dr. Pete was Crane's intellectual superior by general consensus, including Crane's own, a man of broader reading, more experimental temperament, and a particular interest in what the medical literature of the period was beginning to call constitutional anomalies. Individual physiological variations that could not be explained by current understanding, but that were demonstrably present in certain patients. On September 21, 1864, Dr. Crane wrote to Dr. Pete. The letter covers 4 pages in small, precise handwriting. It describes both incidents in detail: the sealed door, the breathing, the examinations, the boy's condition upon emergence. It describes Elias's character as Crane had observed it over the previous months. It asks, directly and without preamble, whether Dr. Pete had encountered anything in the literature that might account for a child who seals himself in a room, cannot be reached by conventional means during the sealed period, and yet emerges in sound health following durations without food or water that should, by conventional medical understanding, produce at least the symptoms of acute deprivation, if not its more severe consequences. Dr. Pete's reply arrived on October 3rd, 11 days later. It is a remarkable document. Not because it explains anything, but because Dr. Pete, who was by all accounts a man of rigorous empiricism, opens it with a paragraph that Dr. Crane later described, in a letter to a third colleague, as the most disturbing thing a rational man ever wrote to me. Dr. Pete wrote, "I have seen one case in 26 years of practice that I have never been able to account for satisfactorily. I did not publish it because I could not present it without the appearance of having lost my scientific sense. I will describe it to you briefly and then tell you what I believe, for whatever my belief is worth under the circumstances. In 1851, I was called to examine a woman in her middle 30s who had been found locked in a cellar room of her home for what her family estimated was 12 days. She was alive. She was not, by any clinical standard I could apply, in a condition consistent with 12 days of complete deprivation. She was weak, certainly. She was underweight. But she was not in the condition of dying. She was, instead, in the condition of someone who has been asleep for a very long time. A deep, slow, almost mechanical sort of consciousness that reminded me of nothing so much as the hibernation state one observes in certain animals. I never found an explanation. I published nothing. I have thought about it since, on and off, whenever I encounter a case that makes no sense. What you are describing is similar in this respect. The physiology suggests a kind of metabolic suspension, a profound slowing of all biological processes, not to the point of death, but to the point where ordinary requirements for sustenance are dramatically reduced. I do not know what causes this. I do not know whether it is voluntary or involuntary, or some combination of both that our current vocabulary does not have words for. I do not know whether to call it a gift or a disease. What I would strongly advise is observation. Extended, careful, well-documented observation. Whatever is happening in this boy is either explicable, in which case documentation will eventually reveal the explanation, or it is not, in which case it will be among the most significant medical observations of our century. Go back to that house, Emmett. Watch carefully. Write down everything." Dr. Crane received this letter on October 3rd. The next incident had already begun on October 1st. Prosper Lane at the general store on Mill Street was among the last people in Harlow County to speak to August Voss before the third and longest incident began. He saw August on the afternoon of October 1st, purchasing a small quantity of flour and a box of cut nails. August was, Lane later told Dr. Felder, his usual self. Not much to say, paid what he owed, asked about nothing. Lane asked August how the boy was doing. August paused in the act of collecting his package. "About the same," he said after a moment. He walked back to his farm. That evening, according to Ruth's account, the family ate supper together. Elias ate, more than usual actually. Ruth noted this specifically. He had second helpings of the bean soup, which was unlike him. He drank 2 full cups of water. He seemed, if anything, more present than usual, more willing to look directly at people, more responsive when spoken to. After supper, August told him to go to bed early, that he looked tired. Elias stood up from the table and looked at his father for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be in my room for a while." Ruth later said that she remembered this moment with particular sharpness because of the way he said it. Not, "I'm going to my room." Not, "I'm going to bed." "I'll be in my room for a while," as if he were informing them of a schedule they should be aware of. August said, "Get some sleep." Elias went upstairs. Ruth followed approximately 20 minutes later to say goodnight. The door would not open. She stood at the door for a long moment. Then she went back downstairs and told August. August sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "We'll check in the morning." Ruth did not sleep well that night. She described lying awake, listening to the sounds of the house, the settling of old timber, the distant creek, a wind that came up around midnight and moved through the pine trees on the west side with a sound she had always found comforting, but that night found merely loud. In the morning, the door held. The morning after that, it held. By October 5th, 4 days in, August sent for Dr. Crane. Dr. Crane arrived on October 5th and set into motion an investigation that would last, in its various phases, for the next 3 weeks. He began by doing what Dr. Pete had advised. He wrote everything down. His October 1864 notes run to approximately 60 pages of manuscript, portions of which were later copied and sent to Dr. Pete, portions of which were deposited with the county recorder's office as part of a formal physician's report, and portions of which, the most personal and speculative portions, remained in his private papers until his death in 1891. What follows is drawn from all 3 sources. Day 1 of the examination. Dr. Crane arrived and performed the now familiar sequence. The door, the latch, the attempt to enter, the failure. He pressed his ear to the door and listened. The breathing was there, slower than it had been in the previous 2 incidents, almost imperceptible, but present. He asked Ruth to describe Elias's behavior in the weeks leading up to this episode. She described the increased food consumption at supper, the apparent alertness. Dr. Crane noted this carefully. He then did something he had not done in the previous 2 incidents. He asked Ruth to show him every room in the house that was adjacent to Elias's room, or below it, or connected to it in any way. Ruth's room shared a wall with Elias's room, the wall through which the internal door had been cut in 1851 or 1852. That door was now sealed from within, but the wall itself was ordinary plaster on wood lath, 18 inches thick by Dr. Crane's estimate. Below Elias's room, on the ground floor, was the pantry-turned storage room. Dr. Crane examined this carefully. He looked at the ceiling, which was the underside of Elias's floor, for any gaps or openings. He found none of significance. He then asked about the baseboard gap he had noted in the room itself. Ruth said she didn't know what he was referring to. Dr. Crane explained where it was. Ruth said she thought it had always been there. Dr. Crane asked her, what was on the other side of that baseboard, in the wall, below the floor? Ruth said she thought there was just the wall structure. Dr. Crane knocked on the baseboard section in question. The sound was different from the sections on either side, not dramatically, but perceptibly, less solid. He noted this and moved on. He checked the window of Elias's room from the outside, using a ladder borrowed from the barn. The nails were in place. No sign of recent disturbance. He checked the roofline above the room. Nothing. He came back inside and sat in the hallway outside the sealed door for a total of 9 hours on October 5th, leaving only briefly for meals and once to examine a patient in town who could not be put off. He heard the breathing throughout. Day 5, October 9th. The door held. Dr. Crane had been making daily visits, spending between 2 and 8 hours at the house. He had begun what he described as systematic sensory analysis, listening at different points on the wall and floor with a glass pressed against the surface, a technique he had read about in a medical text from Edinburgh and found, in practice, more effective than direct listening. From this analysis, he determined that the breathing sound was consistently strongest at the baseboard on the west wall of the hallway, the exterior of the room, and weakest at the door itself. This was anatomically peculiar if the boy was lying in the room's only bed, which was against the east wall, furthest from the baseboard. He noted this. Day 9, October 13th, a Saturday. Crane arrived at the farm at 7 in the morning to find Ruth in the kitchen and August outside. He went directly upstairs and spent the first hour at the door and wall as usual. Then he did something he had been deliberating about for several days. He asked Ruth to bring him a piece of bread. She brought it. He broke it into several small pieces. He slid the pieces under the door. The gap at the bottom of the door was perhaps 3/4 of an inch, enough for small objects to pass through. He watched. For approximately 10 minutes nothing happened. Then the pieces of bread were moved. Not taken, moved. Shifted slightly on the floor beyond the door, as if a hand had touched them without picking them up. Dr. Crane sat back. He went downstairs and wrote in his notes for 45 minutes without stopping. Day 13, October 17th. Dr. Crane arrived and knocked as usual. The door opened, not in the way it had opened previously, in that slow, gravity-assisted swing. This time there was resistance, then a gradual yielding, as if something on the other side was moving away from it. Dr. Crane pushed and the door opened. Elias was sitting on the bed, eyes open this time, looking directly at the door as it opened. "Hello," Dr. Crane said. "Hello," said Elias. He had been sealed in the room for 16 days. Dr. Crane's examination that day was the most thorough of all. He brought with him a scale borrowed from Prosper Lane's store, a measuring rod, and a set of examination instruments he used in hospital work when such work was available to him. Elias's weight, 41 pounds. His weight on the August examination, 42.5, a loss of 1.5 pounds over 16 days. Dr. Crane read that figure 3 times before writing it down. In his notes he wrote, "By every established medical principle I possess, a child of this age and weight, without food or water for 16 days, should be dead. At minimum, the evidence of severe dehydration and acute malnutrition should be unmistakable. I observe instead a child who has lost less than 4% of his body weight and who presents, in every clinical indicator I can measure, as adequately nourished and hydrated. I cannot explain this. I will not pretend that I can." He asked Elias what he had eaten in the room. Elias said, "Nothing." "Did you drink anything? Water from any source?" "No." "Were you hungry?" A pause. "Not really." "Were you thirsty?" Another pause. "A little. At the beginning, less after." Dr. Crane pressed. "What happened after the first day or two? How did you feel?" Elias thought about this with the characteristic seriousness he brought to all questions. "Slower," he said finally, like everything got slower, like a clock running down. Dr. Crane wrote this down. He then asked the question he had been building toward for 2 weeks. "Elias, do you know why you go into your room like this?" The boy looked at him. It was the look Ruth had described, the look Agnes Pruitt had noted in the schoolroom, the look that everyone who spent significant time with Elias eventually encountered and was unable to fully articulate. Something in it that was more than attentiveness, something in it that suggested the boy was weighing not just his answer, but the questioner's capacity to receive it. "Something tells me to," he said. "Something inside you? A feeling?" "Yes." "When does it tell you?" "A little before it needs to happen." Dr. Crane's pen was very still on the page as he wrote this. "And when it needs to happen," he said, keeping his voice level and professional. "What is it that needs to happen? What is the room for?" Elias looked at the window. The nailed window, the west wall, the gap in the baseboard. "I don't know exactly," he said. "It's like when you know a storm is coming. You don't know the storm, but you know to come in." He did not tell August or Ruth what he was planning. He returned the next morning, October 18th, with a small chisel and a mallet. and he told the family he needed to examine the baseboard section he had noted on his first extended visit. He told them it was a routine investigation of the room's ventilation. He was lying, and he suspected they knew it, but no one said so. The baseboard section, the one below the nailed window, the one that ran 14 inches along the west wall before pressing back against the plaster, came away from the wall with minimal effort. One or two of the nails that held it had already pulled loose from the aged wood, and the warping that had caused the gap was significant enough that the board was essentially free at one end. Behind it was the wall structure, the outer clapboard siding, the airspace between siding and interior plaster, and the lath and plaster interior wall itself. The airspace was approximately 3 inches wide. Inside it, running along the bottom of the space, was a gap in the exterior siding, a warped and partially split section of the lowest clapboard, about 18 inches in length, that had opened away from the house by perhaps 1.5 inches at its widest point. Not enough to see through, not enough to reach a hand through, but enough for air to move through. Enough, if you were very small or very thin, or neither of those things but something else, for something to pass. Dr. Crane crouched there for a long time, looking at this gap. He thought about the bread pieces that had been moved, but not taken. He thought about 1.5 pounds of weight lost in 16 days. He thought about the breathing he had heard through the walls, strongest at the baseboard, weakest at the door. He thought about a boy who consumed more than usual at the last meal before sealing himself away, who reported being thirsty at first and then less so, who described the experience as everything getting slower, like a clock running down. He thought about Dr. Pete's letter. Metabolic suspension, a profound slowing of all biological processes. He thought about hibernation. He did not replace the baseboard immediately. He spent another 20 minutes examining the exterior of the house from the outside. He had done this before, but now he had a specific section to look at. The bottom clapboard on the west wall, approximately at floor height, where the gap in the siding was. From the outside, at ground level, the gap was not visible. It was hidden behind a rank of dry summer grass that had grown up against the house foundation and not been cleared. He parted the grass. The gap was there. He crouched at it for a long moment and thought about 3 things in sequence. First, what could pass through a gap of 1.5 inches by 18 inches at ground level, through the wall cavity, and through the baseboard gap of 1.5 inches into a sealed room? Second, was there any evidence that anything had? Third, if something had, was that the explanation for the boy's survival, or merely part of it? He found, caught in the grain of the outer clapboard near the gap, several small fragments of dried leaf and dust that had the compressed oblique character of material that had been drawn inward by suction rather than blown inward by wind. He found in the wall cavity itself what appeared to be a very faint discoloration of the wood along the bottom, a slightly darker staining, thin and irregular, that he could not definitively identify, but that was consistent to his mind with the passage of moisture over time. He found nothing definitive, nothing that proved, beyond the reach of alternative explanation, that something was coming in through that gap. Something that could, in some form that his medicine did not fully understand, sustain a small, very still, metabolically slowed child for periods of days to weeks. He replaced the baseboard. He drove new nails into it with the mallet. He made the gap as small as he could manage without replacing the board entirely. He did not tell August or Ruth what he had found or what he suspected. He drove back to town. 2 days after Dr. Crane's examination of the baseboard, Ruth Voss knocked on the door of his practice in town. She sat down in the chair across from his desk and looked at him with the frank, assessing directness that was characteristic of her, and she said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to listen without deciding what it means until I'm done." Dr. Crane said, "Of course." Ruth said, "Elias has done this before." Dr. Crane waited. "Not as long," she said, "and not with the door sealed like this. When he was younger, 3-4 years old, there were times when he would just stop, not sleep. You could tell he wasn't sleeping because he was still sitting up, or he was in the middle of something and he would just stop, eyes open, still, breathing so slowly you'd put your hand on his chest to make sure, for maybe an hour, maybe two. And then he'd come back. He'd just be back. No distress, no memory of it, or if he had a memory, he wouldn't talk about it. Dr. Crane said, "Did your father notice this?" "My father noticed everything about Elias," Ruth said quietly. "He just didn't talk about most of it." She told Dr. Crane that their mother, Harriet Voss, who died in 1859, had been the first to recognize it. Harriet had called it going away, as in, "Elias went away for a while this afternoon, he's back now, everything's fine," as if it were a voluntary excursion to a place the rest of them could not access, but that Elias could navigate safely. Ruth said that Harriet had not been frightened by it, which Ruth had found both reassuring and confusing in the years since, because Ruth herself found it frightening, and she did not understand how her mother had been so calm. She said she'd read about it, Ruth told Dr. Crane, or heard about it, I don't know where. She said there were people, not many, just some, who could do this, who could slow down inside when the outside got to be too much, she said like a turtle pulling into its shell. Dr. Crane was very still. She called it going away, he said. Yes, and she wasn't frightened. She said it was a gift. She said it kept him safe. Ruth's voice held something complicated on the last word. Not disagreement exactly. More like the discomfort of a reasonable person confronting an unreasonable fact. She died before he got old enough for it to get this extended. I don't know what she would have said about this. Dr. Crane asked Ruth if she had ever heard of anyone else in the family, on either her mother's or father's side, exhibiting anything similar. Ruth thought for a moment. She said, "My mother's grandmother. From what my mother told me. She was very old when she died. Older than anyone could account for, everyone said. And she had a reputation for lasting through things that should have killed her. A bad winter when she was young. A illness that took everyone else in her house. They called her." Ruth paused, and something that might have been the edge of a rueful smile crossed her face. They called her hard to lose. Dr. Crane wrote this in his notes. Hard to lose, he wrote. This is, perhaps, the most precise description I have yet encountered. The sealed incidents did not continue in the same form after October. There was one more, in late October, 5 days, the shortest of the extended episodes. Elias emerged from it on the 30th of the month, again in adequate health, again with that quality of careful, returned attention that those around him had come to associate with his re-emergence from these states. Dr. Crane was there when the door opened that last time. He was sitting in the hallway, as he had been on multiple occasions over the previous weeks, his notebook on his knee and his pen in his hand. Elias opened the door himself this time, from the inside, with the latch, in the ordinary fashion of a person leaving a room. He looked at Dr. Crane sitting on the floor of the hallway and said, with the closest thing to humor that Dr. Crane had observed in him, "You didn't have to stay." "I know," Dr. Crane said. He performed his examination. Elias was well, 4 pounds lighter than his pre-episode weight this time, the most significant loss of any of the incidents, which Dr. Crane attributed to the repairs to the baseboard and the reduction in the gap through which he still believed, without being certain, that something passed to sustain the boy. Afterward, while August and Ruth were downstairs preparing a meal, the first meal after a sealing was always a significant occasion, handled with a quiet deliberateness by both father and daughter, neither of them willing to underplay the ordinary miracle of a child sitting down to eat. Dr. Crane sat with Elias in the cleared hallway and asked him one final question. "Are you afraid?" he said. "When you're in there? When it's happening?" Elias considered this with his characteristic care. "At the beginning, a little," he said, "when I was smaller, but not now." "Why not?" "Because I always come back." Dr. Crane looked at this 7-year-old boy. Small, fine-boned, dark-haired, grey-eyed, sitting in the hallway of a Georgia farmhouse in the last days of October 1864, with the particular unassuming composure of a person who had some deep and private understanding of his own nature that no one else in his vicinity shared. "How do you know you'll always come back?" Dr. Crane asked. Elias looked at him. "Because it's not to take me away," he said. "It's to keep me here." Dr. Crane's letter to Dr. Pete, dated November 3rd, 1864, is the last document in this chain of correspondence that remains in complete form. It covers 11 pages and constitutes, in effect, a comprehensive medical report on the events of September and October, the sealed incidents, the examinations, the findings, and the testimony of Ruth Voss. Dr. Crane concluded the letter with what amounts to a professional confession. "I have documented what I observed. I have attempted to identify every possible conventional explanation and found each of them insufficient. The gap in the baseboard and the exterior siding presents the only physical mechanism by which something could pass into that sealed room. And yet, even if I accept fully the theory of some environmental factor entering through that gap and contributing to the boy's metabolic state, I cannot account for the sealing of the door, the apparent voluntary initiation of these episodes, or the fact that they correlate with periods of external stress in the boy's life. Stress which he does not appear to consciously register, but which his body seems to register with extraordinary precision. I leave it to you to determine whether this is a disease requiring treatment, a constitutional anomaly requiring documentation, or something else entirely that neither of us has adequate vocabulary for. I will only say that having spent 6 weeks in the company of this child and his father and sister, I do not believe he is in danger. I believe, in fact, that he is one of the least vulnerable people I have ever examined. Whatever mechanism operates within him, and I am satisfied that it is a mechanism, not a mystery, in the sense that it has causes and effects that are, in principle, knowable even if they are not yet known to us. It seems to exist for the purpose of his protection. His mother called it a gift. I am not a poetic man. I prefer to call it an extremely efficient adaptation to conditions that would otherwise be lethal. But I understand what she meant. Dr. Pete replied in December 1864. His letter, which survives in the Pete family papers held by the Georgia Historical Society, is largely taken up with a summary of the German and French medical literature on states of reduced metabolic activity, a field that was in its earliest stages in that period and would not produce serious systematic research for another 3 decades. He found nothing that satisfactorily explained Elias's case. He said so, clearly, without apology. In the letter's final paragraph, Dr. Pete wrote, "I have been a physician for 29 years. In that time I have seen the body do things that have made me reconsider, on multiple occasions, the limits of what I thought I understood about it. I have never, however, encountered a case that unsettled those limits as thoroughly as the one you have described. Not because it suggests the impossible. I do not believe anything in your account is strictly impossible, but because it suggests that there are people among us who have retained by some accident of heredity or circumstance a capacity that the rest of us have lost. A capacity to be, in some fundamental biological sense, more resilient than we have any right to expect. I find that disturbing in the way that all genuinely important things are disturbing, because it changes the shape of what I thought I knew. I would very much like to meet this boy. He never did. Dr. Pete died in February 1865, a victim of the same fever epidemic that took several other Savannah residents that winter. He was 53 years old. The sealed incidents, as they were referred to in Dr. Crane's notes, did not stop entirely after October 1864, but they changed in character. Over the following years, as documented in sporadic notes from Dr. Crane's practice and in the personal diary of Agnes Pruitt, Elias continued to exhibit the same quality of periodic withdrawal. But it became, as he grew older, less dramatic, less total. The door sealing did not recur after the last October episode. Instead, the withdrawals became internal. Those episodes of deep stillness that his schoolteacher had observed in the classroom, that his mother had called going away, that seemed to come over him in moments of stress or overstimulation and retreat equally quietly when the need had passed. He finished his schooling. He worked the farm. He was, by all accounts of the period, a quiet, competent, peculiar young man who made people slightly uneasy in a way they couldn't articulate, and who, in exchange, seemed to regard the world around him with a patient, tolerant amusement that those who knew him well found oddly comforting. In 1872, he left Harlow County. He moved north, to Atlanta first, then to Tennessee, then to a small town in Virginia, where, according to a letter Ruth received from him in 1874, he had found work as a surveyor's assistant and was doing well. He described the work as requiring long stretches of stillness and attention, which suited him. Ruth wrote back. He replied. This correspondence continued in Ruth's records through 1879, at which point the letters stopped. Not suddenly, but with the gradual attenuation of any correspondence whose participants have settled into separate lives and find themselves with less to report. The last letter Ruth received from Elias, dated the 14th of March, 1879, was brief. He told her that he was well. He told her that he had met a woman named Clara Hennessy, and that they were to be married in June. He said that he had told Clara about the room, about Dr. Crane, about the episodes, in some abbreviated form she could imagine, and that Clara had listened to all of it without alarm. She said what Mama said, Elias wrote. She called it a gift. I suppose by now I believe it. Ruth kept this letter in a box in her room for the rest of her life. Dr. Emmett Crane practiced medicine in Harlow County until his retirement in 1887, a period of 23 more years after the events of 1864. In those years, he published several papers in Georgia and South Carolina medical journals. He considered it at various points. He drafted, according to a note in his private papers, at least 3 versions of a case study that he never submitted to any journal. The final draft, dated 1882, exists in incomplete form. It breaks off at the bottom of the 4th page, mid-sentence, in a passage describing the October examinations, and resumes several pages later with a brief handwritten note that reads, I find that I cannot write about this case in the tone that medical publication requires. The tone requires certainty, or the productive appearance of certainty. Here is a question, here is an investigation, here is a conclusion, and I have no conclusion that does not in the end require the reader to accept that the body is capable of things we have not catalogued. I believe this to be true. But I have spent 18 years not knowing how to say it in a way that will not simply be dismissed by men who have not sat in that hallway and listened through a wall to a breathing that made no sense. Perhaps it is enough that I documented it. Perhaps some other physician, in some other decade, will find the box where I keep these notes and understand what I was trying to say. The boy survived. He was inside a sealed room for 31 total days, across 3 episodes, with minimal sustenance, and he survived. Doctors had no explanation. I am a doctor. I have no explanation. I have only what I observed, and the conviction, unscientific, impractical, and entirely stubborn, that observation, even without conclusion, matters. He survived. That is enough. The Voss farmhouse in Harlow County, Georgia, was still standing as of the 1890 county survey. By the turn of the century, it had passed out of the family's hands. August Voss died in 1886. Ruth sold the property in 1888 and moved to Atlanta, where she lived for another 30 years and died in 1919, the year after the great influenza epidemic, having survived that as well by the simple and complete means of not contracting it. The room in which Elias had sealed himself on those 3 occasions in 1864 was, by the time of the county survey, used for storage. The door was unremarkable. The baseboard had been replaced entirely at some point. New wood, tightly fitted, no gap. Doctor, Crane's notes were deposited with the Harlow County Recorder's Office on his death in 1891, along with a brief letter of instruction that specified they be preserved, but not destroyed. They remained in the county archives, largely unread, until a historian working on a study of rural medicine in Civil War-era Georgia encountered them in 1931 and made copies, which is how they came to the attention of the medical historian who first brought this case to broader notice in the 1940s. The gap in the baseboard was never definitively explained. The sealed door was never definitively explained. The 31 days were never definitively explained. What we have is what Dr. Crane left us. A record of observation, meticulous and honest, made by a man who knew the limits of what he knew and refused to pretend otherwise. A boy went into a sealed room. He should not have survived. He did. He grew up, married Clara Hennessy, and lived, by the available records, into the early years of the 20th century. He would have been in his late 40s or early 50s by the time those records go silent. Nothing in the record suggests he died young. Hard to lose, his great-great-grandmother had been called. It appeared to run in the family.